This is the first PowerPoint in the new format that we're adopting for the rest of the semester. So before we begin, please take a moment just to orient yourself to how this PowerPoint will proceed. We have three grammar terms that we need to get a handle on in this lecture. The first is tense, and most of you should be familiar with how we talk about tense, but I want to point out that here we're using it in a bit more of a specific way than we do in, say, English grammar. Here we're talking about tense as a grammatical category that includes time and aspect. In New Testament Greek, there are four tenses, five really, that we have to worry about. The present, which we've already encountered in the participle, the aorist and the perfect, which we'll encounter this week, and then the imperfect and the future, which will show up in future weeks. As I said, there are two categories for tense: time and aspect. Time is the one that we're more familiar with. Time is when a verb happens, and our three categories for this are generally the past, the present, and the future. But aspect is how a verb happens. Is it happening all at once? Is it a continuing action? And we'll see, because a participle is part verb, it has these tense categories within its meaning. As I said, when it comes to the participle, we only have to worry about three tenses: the present, the aorist, and the perfect. The present, being a present tense, happens at the same time as the main verb, and its aspect is continuous. The aorist is one of our past tenses. It happens before the main verb, and its aspect is one and done. I like to think of this as the lightning tense. The perfect participle also happens before the main verb. It is another one of our past tenses, but in terms of aspect, it indicates an action that is complete but has a continued result. And when we get to our Greek sentences, we'll see how this works. For those of you who are visual learners, it may be helpful to see this represented spatially. If we think of our time as on a line with the past, the present, and the future, when we look at a present verb, we see that the present participle happens at the same time, also in the present. The aorist participle happens just in the past. On the other hand, the perfect participle bridges the two. It's an action completed in the past, but with present results. If we move to a past verb that goes with a participle, we see that everything happens in the past. The present participle happens at the same time as the past verb. The aorist participle happens more in the past than the past verb, and the perfect participle starts earlier in the past, but then becomes contemporaneous with the past verb. We'll revisit this after we look at our Greek sentences, and hopefully it will make more sense then. We'll start our in-depth discussion by taking another look at the present participle. Remember, first of all, that its time is the same time as the main verb, and in aspect it's continuous. It's not an action that happens at one point in time, but an action that continues. If we take a look at Mark 1:13 as an example, we see this phrase, ein en te eremo perazzomenos. We start first by looking at our main verb, which is ein. Ein is the imperfect active from eimi. The imperfect is another one of our past tenses that we'll learn later on, but for our purposes, it's important to know that it's the basic past tense of the verb to be. It means in this case was. And the subject here is Jesus, who was mentioned in the earlier phrase and so is not here. Following that, we have the preposition en, which takes a dative following it, and then the definite article te, the noun eremo, and most importantly, our present participle, perazzomenos. By looking at the men in this participle, we see that it is present passive. And by its ending, because the present participle in the passive uses second declension endings, we know that it's masculine, nominative, and singular, and it describes the subject Jesus. Taken together, we get Jesus was in the wilderness being tested. Because was is a past tense verb, the action of being tested, our participle, also happens in the past. This is what we mean when we say that a present participle has the same time as the main verb. Let's take a look at another example, this time from the book of Revelation. Here we have lege ho echon ta hepta pneumata. Lege is our verb from lego, meaning to say, and here it's in the present and the active. Ho is our old friend, the definite article, masculine nominative singular. Echon is our participle. That omega nu ending tells us it's the present and the active from our verb echo, which means to have or to hold. This is followed by ta hepta pneumata, all of which are neuter, accusative, and plural, and they're the direct object of the holding. And if we translate it, we can translate it as the one who holds the seven spirits says, and then something else follows in Revelation. But the important thing for us here is that says from lego is present tense. And so our present participle echon also happens in the present. The one who holds the seven spirits says. This brings us to our first new tense for the week, the aorist. And in the aorist participle, it is a past tense, so it happens before the main verb. And as I said, this is our one and done tense. It's our lightning tense, an action that happens and is done. In Mark 1:31, we see an example of the aorist. Hoi grammates, hoi katabantes, elegon. Hoi is our definite article in the masculine nominative plural. Grammates is our noun in the masculine nominative plural. As Greek will sometimes do, we see the definite article repeated, hoi again. And then here's our participle, katabantes, meaning to go down, to come down. And it's an aorist active participle in the masculine nominative plural. And it's in that gender, case, and number because it's modifying grammates. So it shares those attributes with it. And finally, we have our verb, elegon. This is the aorist from our verb lego that we saw in the last slide in the present. And so instead of meaning says, here it means said. And because our main verb, elegon, is in a past tense, our participle happens before it in the past. And so we could translate this as the scribes who came down said. And the thing here is it's important to realize that the action came down happens entirely before the speaking. That's what the aorist is trying to get across. In our next example, we see how the aorist works with a present tense verb. In Hebrews 4:3, we get the phrase eis erkometha hoi pistiusantes, eis katapausen. Eis erkometha is our main verb. It's from eis erkomai, which means to enter, and it's present and middle, because the Greeks, for whatever reason, always think of going or coming as being in the middle voice. Hoi is once again our definite article, masculine nominative plural, and pistiusantes is our participle, masculine nominative plural to match hoi, but also in the aorist and the active. Eis is our preposition, followed by an accusative, katapausen, a noun that's feminine accusative singular, and it means rest. It has an interesting ending on it, sigma iota nu, because it's third declension. Remembering that the aorist participle comes before our main verb, we can translate it as we who believed enter into rest. And the important thing here is that the English translation is somewhat ambiguous. But in Greek, it's very clear. The aorist means that this action of believing happened entirely in the past and was done before the entering. The perfect, like the aorist, is also a past tense. But unlike the aorist, which is over and done with, the perfect participle is a past action with continued results. We've already seen this in Mark 1:6. We have the sentence, Ein ho Ioannes endedoumenos trikas kamelu. And here we have several words we've already seen. Ein meaning was, ho, the. Ioannes is the Greek form of the name John. It's masculine nominative singular to go with ho, because remember, Greek often uses the definite article with names. Then we come to our participle, endedoumenos. This is perfect, middle, and masculine nominative singular. This is another good example of the middle. It means to clothe oneself. And for the Greeks, a good middle thought is when you do an action to yourself. Finally, we have trikos, which is a noun, feminine accusative plural. This is the direct object of the participle. And kamelu, which is another noun, masculine genitive singular, and it means camel. Putting it all together, we see John was clothed in camel hair. The important thing here is that was clothed shows us that John did it in the past, but with continued results. The fact that it's a perfect participle means we know that John is still wearing camel hair when this verse takes place. It's not as though at one point in the past he was clothed and now no longer is. We can be sure that John is still dressed by the perfect nature of this participle. To reinforce the idea of the perfect, let's take a look at another passage, again from Revelation. Here we get the phrase eidon kai idou thura ene ogmene. Eidon is a verb. It's aorist and active and means to look or to see, but in the past looked or saw, since the aorist is a past tense after all. Kai is a conjunction that means and. Idou is an interesting word in that it means something along the lines of behold. It's an exclamation. Thura is a noun, feminine nominative singular, and means door. Finally, eneogmene is our participle. It's perfect, passive, and feminine nominative singular. Because it describes door, thura, it shares the same attributes. The translation would go something like this. I looked, and behold, a door that had been opened. This is in the past because our main verb eidon, looked, is also in the past. But what it tells us is that this door which had been opened remains opened at the time that the speaker is describing. It's a past action with present results, that is, results that are contemporary with the main verb. In terms of interpreting the Greek text, when we take a look at our 6 different examples of participles, we see a couple things that they point us towards. Number one, they help flesh out a narrative. They give us extra details about the characters and what they're doing. We see this, for example, in Mark 1:31. The scribes who came down said. Our participle, katabantes, tells us that the scribes have come from somewhere before they speak. In the same way, we see this in Revelation. Our participle, eneogmene, has been opened, describes the door that the speaker sees. Sometimes as well, the participle functions as part of a verb. So in Mark 1:6 and Mark 1:13, we see how the participle completes a verbal thought. John was clothed in camel hair, or Jesus was in the wilderness being tested. Finally, the important thing about the participle is it helps us to make subtle distinctions in our past tenses. We see this most clearly in the difference between Hebrews 4:3 and Mark 1:6. Hebrews 4:3, pistuasantes, contains an aorist participle, which means that the action happened entirely before the main verb. We who believed enter into rest. On the other hand, in Mark 1:6, with our perfect participle, we know that that action continues into the present. John was clothed in camel hair. At the time that the narrator is describing, John is still wearing clothes. Now that we've been through these examples, I invite you to take a look at the visual representation of this again. Take some time here and on the slides that follow to review the things we've learned.